Hello and welcome to the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
I'm Ollie Lum.
And I'm Mike Castle.
We're here to bring you insights around all of the latest cutting-edge research within coach education and practice.
You can stay up to date with all of our latest episodes through the links in the podcast description below.
We hope you enjoy the episode.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Sport Coaching Hub podcast. I'm your host for today, Mike Castle. I'm joined today by Emma and Tallin. Emma, welcome to the pod. For the first time, how are you feeling?
Good, excited. A little bit nervous, but...
Everyone's always nervous on their first one in.
Why.
And Tallin, welcome to you too. Also on debut and joining our ever-growing list of outstanding undergrad students to feature on the pod. How are you feeling?
Better now you've called me outstanding. I'm feeling good. Very happy to be here.
Good, excellent. So we'll kick off with introductions, as you both knew. Emma, and we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about your coaching background and then your current role at the university.
Okay, so I started coaching... Cricket is where I predominantly coach. I started coaching, kind of assisting when I was probably about 14, 15, and then got my first level of coaching, level 1. I got my level 2 when I came to uni first year. Did my level 3 recently. I say recently, 2020. That wasn't recently actually.
Time flies by.
Yeah,
pretty quick.
that's scarily not that far. Yes, and then during university in my master's, I think, or maybe my undergrad, I did both my level 1 and level 2 in football coaching as well. So I've been coaching back home with my cricket club. That was the first place that I coached. 2018, I took on a coach player role within the Cardiff Met women's cricket team and have moved out of the playing side of thing and just coaching those girls. Trying to give them a little bit more stability, and I'm hoping there's been positive things from that because we've got enough for kind of 2 teams now. When I started playing, there was only 6 players, so we've now way over probably about 40 girls. So that's been really good. And then alongside, so Somerset was where I initially started playing my county cricket. I did some county coaching there, just for the pathway age groups with the girls, predominantly coach girls cricket. And more recently I kind of switched over to play for Wales as a county and coaching the Welsh pathways for the girls as well. So
Magic. Are you doing yourself a little bit of a disservice here because you have won an award for your coaching, which was Coach of the Year at Cardiff Met. It was 2 years ago.
Yeah, 2022 I think it was.
How was that?
It was a big shock. I don't know who decided it, but to be fair, like I suppose we did win the National Indoor Championships in 2020, just before the whole COVID fiasco. So yeah, Feb 2020 we won National Indoor Finals up in Birmingham, and then obviously cricket didn't really happen. Nothing really happened, I guess, between that summer and 2021. We kind of had a COVID year of like more regional based stuff where we'd play closer teams. But yeah, I guess it all worked out and I got that in. And then Geth, who I work with as well, Geth Smart, he won it this year just gone. So
a strong pedigree in Cardiff Met cricket is what
Cardiff
I'm hearing
cricket,
here. Absolutely.
Striving forward.
Good, excellent. And currently a PhD student. Any other roles at the university?
Yes, I have many part-time jobs. But I am, since 2022, I've been an associate tutor in sports coaching. The first year that I did that, I was a personal tutor in level 4 sports coaching. And now I'm currently teaching on the sports foundation degree. I'm also a research assistant, so I've been doing some relevant work with some of my PhD work with DARPL and the School of Education and Policy, so the Diversity and Anti-Racist Professional Learning that they've got there, and I've been helping on that. I did a little bit of work on the Indigenous education that they have down in New Zealand. At the moment, I'm working on looking at the anti-racist initial teacher training, education. So yeah, I've been doing that, and then I've also been doing an SU internship which I've managed to drag out for a long time. And that was around changing the culture. So I guess they've all kind of really interlinked with either coaching and or equality, diversity and inclusivity. So yeah, with changing the culture, it was the idea that we had a bit of funding. We were able to run an EDI course essentially for some of the students that the timing wasn't great, but they still had some students there, and we got somebody to come in and have some proper kind of deconstructing of biases, people's thoughts, beliefs, to try and see if we can start the ball rolling in changing the culture of kind of the stereotypical sports environments. Great. That those stereotypes kind of come out. And so, yeah, I've worked on that as well.
Perfect. And we'll talk in a little bit of detail about your PhD work as well. Nice to hear that that work isn't just sitting purely in sport coaching, though. It's being taken out into wider piece of work as well. I know that DARPL stuff is highly successful at the minute, and obviously a really good cause. So that's nice. Tallin, tell us about yourself.
Hi. Right off the bat, I feel like it's worth stating. I'm a trans feminine lesbian. So the kind of discussions we're going to be having today around marginalised groups within sports coaching and higher education and society in general, are very personal to me and very applicable to a lot of my experiences and my studies. With regards to coaching, I'm a relative newbie in comparison to Emma and yourself. I've only really been involved within the role of a coach for the past 3 or 4 years or so. But for most of my life, I've been playing sports. I've been around sporting environments. I played rugby for around 13 years to a pretty high standard. I was involved with the Gloucester Rugby Developing Player Programme. Played for the Welsh Exiles briefly, and that was up until around 2021, which is when I came to uni after COVID. And for the last, like I said, 3 or 4 years, I've been playing and more recently coaching volleyball. Last year I got my level 1 in volleyball coaching, and I was the assistant coach for the Bucks women's team. And I've just recently taken over the role of the head coach of the university team. And yeah, it's a role I'm very much looking forward to taking, and hoping I do a good enough job. And I'm currently studying sports coaching, Bachelor in Science honours degree, which is a degree talking about the social theories as well as pedagogical theories around sports coaching, and applying them to coaching practice and education as a whole. And I'm currently breaking ground on my dissertation, which is looking at transgender experiences within sport from an autoethnographic perspective.
So, before we get into the pod, we thought it maybe be helpful for us in the room, but also for listeners as well, just to add a little bit of a preface to today's episode. So given the topic areas, Tallin sort of touched on just a little bit there, and maybe some of the noise that happens to surround that topic area, we want to try and get away from maybe some of the mainstream discussions that are happening through the topic area, but also overcome some of the silence that maybe people feel a little bit bound to for fear of making errors. We're going to be quite open today. And this hopefully will be a space for us where we're going to make mistakes as we go through the pod. No sort of judgments, I suppose, with any errors, and we're going to sort of learn and help one another. This is a topic area that I'm very unfamiliar with, so no doubt I'll make some mistakes on the way through. And I'm looking forward to Emma and Tallin helping me to understand some of the work that's out there currently within marginalised groups in coaching, and yeah, I guess the discussion is maybe going to be shaped in a sense of it's a little bit of a systematic review, informed largely by Emma's doctoral work thus far, and then we'll talk a little bit about what Tallin's going to be using for the dissertation moving forwards. So, Emma, that's your cue. Your PhD is going to go a really long way to informing some of the discussions that we have today. So can you tell us a little bit about your studies, your PhD thus far, maybe specifically the rationale for the project, because that's always an interesting one for us.
Yeah, so I suppose initially having looked at kind of my higher education experience. I did sports science in undergrad, realised that sports coaching, luckily, was still an option for me to have as you well know, as you used to take my seminars as an optional module, and then that allowed me to do my dissertation within sports coaching, then leading me towards my master's within sports coaching, and my dissertation thesis specifically was on kind of gender, but also an amalgamation of Garfinkel's ethno-methodology of doing coaching, but through the lens of Agnes, who was the case study that he looked at with regards to like passing as a transgender woman. So that was really interesting. That was kind of my into kind of, I guess, more, I don't know how to say, more specific or more kind of abstract ways of looking at gender in coaching. And I think that was something that I was really interested in, and something Charlie kind of helped me navigate, as he is amazing at Garfinkel's work, as it's something he's worked with quite closely. And then for my PhD, I think I kind of based it on it was my experience initially. My personal rationale was the fact that as a female coach, I've always felt, more specifically when in and around like boys, that I've had to prove myself as a coach and have to have the right qualifications, have played to the right standard for them to be able to feel like they can take information from me or take feedback, or something like critical, for example. If I've said maybe you should do this or maybe you should do that, they need to think that I'm of a standard so they can listen to it, so it's not worth their time kind of thing. And that stems from when I was covering a coaching session for a boys age group at my club, and I was the most qualified coach there. I think I was a couple of years older than one of the other coaches as well. But it was quite obvious that because he was male, he kind of commanded the room, got that respect initially just from being male, just from being taller than me, those kind of things. And it kind of boiled down to this young boy turned around and said, what do you know? You're a girl. And that, I think, has been something it's clearly stuck with me, because I was probably about 17, 18 at the time. So that's been 10 years. So that's something that's kind of fueled me to understand why these things kind of happen. And then from that, we were having a look at, me and Sophia, my director of studies, we were going back and forth about what should we look at? What should we look at with regards to gender in coaching? And then we said, I had a little think about, should we look at why females don't tend to go on to higher education with regards to the masters in sports coaching? They might go towards a PGCE. That's something that quite a lot of female students go towards, but not necessarily for the masters. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. If we're looking at that, why don't we look at all marginalised groups? Maybe have a look at that. And then we were maybe going to have a little look at the undergrad. And then we thought that could be quite difficult if we're working with staff. There's a lot of staff that intertwine, dip in and out of the undergraduate degree. And then we kind of settled on, how about we look at the master's course, working with the staff, because we knew it was a set number of staff, and just went from there. And it was the aim to try and see if we could make a more inclusive and diverse master's program.
So in prep for the pod, when we were talking a little bit about those ideas or sharing those ideas, we spoke about perhaps the project maybe evolving a little bit, like you're saying there. It started maybe very broad, marginalised groups generally within coaching, and then it was like, well, maybe do we look at coaching in higher education? And then, if you look at the demographic of the master's program here, then it's very sort of white, male, etc. So that's sort of fine-tuned your view or the scope that you're taking with the project. So how have you managed that, I suppose, over time? And when you've come to maybe structuring and looking at the literature, how broad have you started? How narrow have you got? And what sort of things are coming out of that lit review?
So initially, I've refined it a couple of times now, but the first time I went into the lit review process, it was just kind of, I want to try and find as much information as possible regarding all these different areas of marginalised groups' experience within like the workplace, within higher education, within sport, within coaching, with the idea that I wanted to see if there was a reflection of society within coaching, sports, etc. So I started quite broad, and then as it went through and I could see, it was essentially as I've refined it and I found a little bit more of a narrative as to how I want to paint the picture, going from society, kind of the workplace, I think higher education, and then it was sports and then sports coaching, I think is how I've kind of moved it down. It was essentially that regardless of what I'm reading about, marginalised groups, all kind of marginalised groups, which I've tried to have a look at in some aspect under the Equalities Act, they are not treated as the same as the white straight counterpart that they might be coming up against. There's just constant just lack of support, lack of opportunities, lack of thought around what these marginalised groups might need in order to have the same, like the equity, having the same opportunities as those that are in the kind of the predominant space. So yeah, it started like that, and then as you said, through the focus groups, I think that was, so I did 6 focus groups for my data collection, and we went in there. The first 2 topics were kind of, I guess, low risk. They were quite abstract topics. So I started with Welsh identity, to have a little think about what does it mean to have a Welsh identity? Is there a possibility to have a Welsh identity on the sports coaching master's course? Which was something, quite abstract. And for those that, there was a few people that were Welsh and then weren't Welsh within the group. So it was quite interesting to have those kind of conversations. And then it went on to criticality, with the idea that Welsh identity is kind of built on these 3 C's that I guess kind of came up with regards to care, criticality and confidence. The idea that the Welsh are very caring. They're looking for the people that are like marginalised as a country that has been marginalised and colonised for years. That came from that. And then confidence, the confidence to go against the status quo, to go against the people that are telling them that they need to do this, whether it's governmental, whether it's whatever, to go against the status quo and not kind of be the underdog and stand up for themselves. So it was that idea. And then also criticality, being critical of what's being asked of them and then what's being said. So that's where that kind of stemmed from. It was a kind of an abstract, looking back now, it's quite abstract, but I think it allowed us to open the gateway to these more sensitive topics. So we went on to criticality with my idea of, if we get a group understanding of what criticality is, which definitely was proved harder than first thought, but then I would enable them, the group, to be critical of the notions that I was then going to be presenting to them, with the next ones being the definition of equality, diversity and inclusivity, looking at colourblindness. This spiraled on, and with action research, I didn't necessarily know what I was going to be presenting next, but due to the nature of the conversations we were having and the group that we had, race was the forefront of our conversations, just because as an all-white group, it was just something that was naturally, clearly something that a lot of people were thinking about and were very aware of within the environment and the institution as a wider place. So that moved it and that shaped it, and that meant we went on to, I introduced the notion of white fragility, how white people react and respond to talking about race, and then also the final notion that I presented was the impact of silence.
Yeah. Okay. And you've mentioned action research there, so I guess that's probably a really nice time for me to refer our listeners to perhaps the episode with Manuel and Robin about creativity, because Manuel spoke a little bit about some of the challenges around action research, or our understanding of, well, what does action research, what's it meant to look like, what's the premise of it. But let's talk a little bit about some of your methodology there, your sampling, the kind of the framing of it a little bit. When you've gone into that sampling, you've selected the masters, you sort of realised, okay, very sort of, white, straight, male, non-marginalised groups, if you like. That was somewhat accidental, or was it purposive? It wasn't surprising necessarily to see that, but was there which came first? Was it, I'm going to pick that group because it looks very sort of exclusive, it's not particularly sort of diverse, and so that's a really good group to study? Or was it a little bit of convenience? Okay, that program exists, that's a really nice one for us to do and get some research on what we're doing here at the university, and it just so happened that was the demographic, and so that's led you then with your reading?
I think it most likely came down to almost like the access that I had to potential individuals, having Sophia as my director of studies, but also the program director, I think kind of led to that. And I think that was also one of the main reasons why we didn't look at the undergrad, just because there were so many gatekeepers, or there were so many other people involved, whether it was modular, it just was a lot more uniform within the master's setup. And there was like one person per module. There wasn't one person leading a module and then X amount of people then teaching on that module. It was kind of standalone. So I think it was kind of convenience, but also an active decision to choose the master's group. But then almost accidental that we then stumbled upon the topics that we were talking about. Because like I said, with action research, I was actually quite afraid moving forward. I was like, there's very little theoretical concepts with regards to kind of like race and racism, unless you're talking about critical race theory, which was way back in America with the civil rights movement. And I guess there's so many different things and nuances and things that have changed, especially even in the UK. It's not a direct comparison, and being able to pick that up and put that into our context. So I was a bit worried. I was like, I don't know what kind of literature is out there. But through the discussions that we had, and then supervisory discussions, it was just kind of like a really good collaborative process. Yeah,
that network always really important when it comes to reading. I mean, you mentioned Robin and others there sending papers through. I mean, even later stages of your writing and understanding your findings and trying to find that something new, just one paper that's sent to you by someone can make a huge difference. Certainly did for me. So probably important I flag up to the listeners here, we're steering away from talking about people in minorities here, and we're talking about marginalised groups. There's quite a distinct difference between the two of them. And you've just talked there about having a little bit of a worry about what was going to be out there in your reading. So let's get a little bit into that. And Tallin, by all means, weigh in here, because I know some of your reading will come in handy. What's the literature saying about marginalised groups, generally speaking, but also perhaps then in coaching or higher education?
So it's interesting that we're talking about the minority side of things with regards to, through the work I've been doing with DARPL, as I've been doing some of this stuff with the initial teacher education, a lot more has come up. And I think this is a big thing, and a big thing to note is the fact that I think what scares people the most is the fact that terminology and the language that is used moves so quickly that it's a daunting prospect to potentially be caught up in, like, for example, saying minorities or ethnic minorities, when actually, if you look at it, statistically, they're the global majority if you're talking about non-white people. So I think that's a big thing as to why people are so scared about talking about it, because that's something that I've noticed, just from the DARPL stuff I've been doing, is the global majority is something that is the terminology that's used now, because it reflects society, the world. So, but as I've said previously with my literature review, it's the fact that there are obviously playing nations. For example, in cricket, there was I think it was a paper back in 2009 which looked at the British Asian experience within cricket, and it was the idea. I know more has come out since then, and the ECB have had to do a whole big kind of scope to understand exactly what's going on. But the idea that it was normalized as banter to just have like microaggressions and that kind of attitude towards potential marginalized groups within that environment, even though when you think about it, how big these cricket playing nations are in South Asia, you've got India, Pakistan, they're huge nations, and it's just not reflected in the amount of people that are playing cricket within the UK. There's probably so many South Asian individuals. It could be West Indian individuals. All these people that are non-white from cricket-playing nations are clearly not playing cricket in the UK for a reason. So, and I think that's a similar thing to like the football as well. Another thing that I saw, it was the fact that there's a clear percentage of football teams in the Premier League that have so many non-white players, and then the lack of non-white coaching staff, whether they move on to managerial roles, whether they're part of support staff. There's a clear disconnect there. And then also it's just stuff like that with regards to like the media perception of people that are non-white. So, for example, the racism that came from the Euros, when there's an issue, it's one of those things when we're winning, when we're doing well, everyone's celebrated, and then when there's a missed penalty and the person who's taking it just so happens to be black, that's when there's a big backlash. So it's the narrative that's portrayed around these individuals, as well as like groups. It's just but then you see it in society, for example, in workplace, and I looked at things like sexuality, religion, like Muslim women, for example, are the least likely to participate in sport. They are some of like the lowest percentage of women like with religious beliefs to be participating in sport. So it's those kind of things of like, what's the reason why? But I don't know if there's necessarily loads of stuff being done to try and improve that. So I think it's just been little bits here and there, and it's the same with higher education. Looking at individuals, like, is there enough being done to ensure that those people feel like they've got a space that they can go? Do they feel like they deserve to be there? Do they feel like they should be there? Yeah, it's those kind of things that I think a lot more can be done.
Great. And Tallin, anything for you want to add in there?
Yeah, so I'm specifically talking about like the example of sports when it comes to marginalised groups. I mean, we saw I don't want to say good because good feels like the wrong word. We saw a very like clear example of the way marginalised groups are treated within sports at the most recent Olympics. Like we saw the reaction to I can't for the life of me remember his name, but the Chinese swimmer who was doing well, was in the Olympics as a swimmer, was doing his sport. And because of how well he was doing, he was getting drug tested to a point where he was not able to sleep properly at night, and it was actively affecting his performance just of how frequently they were testing him for like illegal substances because people were insistent on the fact that like this doesn't seem physically possible. He must be cheating. Whereas you look at the reaction to swimmers like, for example, Michael Phelps, who is, an incredible athlete, and it's only ever framed as him being an incredible athlete. There's never any speculation about whether he was taking illegal substances, whether he was cheating, any of that stuff. There seems a disproportionate amount of suspicion directed at non-white athletes, and I mean we saw it as well with the boxing, with the Algerian boxer who was accused of being transgender, despite there being no proof out there. And, I mean, that in itself is something that gets targeted at non-white athletes a lot, because the sort of picture of femininity, which people expect, doesn't tend to line up with how genetically people of colour are. Like their facial structure is different, and it doesn't hold up to that same beauty standard which is imposed upon everyone regardless of race, ethnicity, background, whatever. So it tends to be those people who are far easier targets for the kind of, I mean, to put it frankly, hatred and bigotry that we saw targeted at this specific athlete recently.
Yeah. Do you think those sort of higher profile examples or those higher profile instances that get widespread attention through the media cause more harm than good? Like you're saying, you had fears about the literature base. Was there going to be enough there? Is there anything in there that's telling us, well, this is what to do, or this is what we can do better? versus then this huge sort of almost tidal wave, it seems at times, of media attention and therefore sort of, derogatory terms flying around, those sorts of things that come from one instance like we've seen in the Olympics, for example.
Yeah. I mean, from what I've seen at least, the kind of coverage that gets that shows up for these kind of these acts of hatred, because I mean that is at the end of the day what they are. It all tends to be either taking a stance of neutrality that only ends up benefiting the people that are being hateful, or it basically outright supports the people that are being hateful, like especially from major media personalities. Not gonna name anyone in particular, but there's a very specific few examples that I'm sure immediately spring to mind.
Okay.
And I one thing that I tried to portray within my lit review was the fact that it's very kind of report based. I'm sure it doesn't take you too long to probably assume that reports, I guess, and literature doesn't necessarily need to be written for you to probably have an understanding that the way marginalised groups are treated is probably not as good as their white, straight counterparts, for example. So I think it was the idea that having read all this, I wasn't surprised, for one, but also it felt as if it was just kind of like, here you go, here are the stats, this is what it looks like, but not really being like, right, so from this, we're going to learn from this and we're going to try and do this. We're going to try and do this intervention. And I think that was also, that's kind of, I guess, a theoretical or rationale for my study. The other side of it is the fact that my work is trying to do something about it. Whether or not it has monumental change is a completely different thing. But it's, if not now, then when? Just because we don't fall into those marginalised groups. And Manel asked me this when I was observing in one of the sessions, master's sessions. He was like, "What? Why are you doing it as a white female?" And I was like, I 100% understand that, and I think that's something that I've come to terms with. And also, the process that we went through wasn't to speak on the behalf of marginalised groups. It was to understand the impact of whiteness. So I think that was how it changed, and that was how it made a lot more sense in my head. I didn't feel comfortable trying to, I was never going to, but the concept of trying to speak for marginalised groups, that I can only speak from a woman in sport, which I guess is a minority in some respects, but as a white woman, I understand my privilege in other spaces. So I think it was the idea that trying to deconstruct whiteness and talk about whiteness and talk about the fears, the concerns that individuals have about that. And I think, that was kind of not surprised by the literature that was found, but also there was a severe lack of literature that was trying to improve it and trying to do something about it.
Yeah. So like you say, I mean, it's one thing to deconstruct, it's one thing to make sense of, to understand, to explore. It's a whole other thing to create action, to do something about it. So was the choice for action research really intentional because you wanted to create, those potential interventions? You wanted to explore the impact of actually doing something on, like in this particular context, the whiteness of that particular environment?
Yeah, and I think also when it comes to action research, it's so heavily linked with social justice. So I think it fits in. I'm writing for a book chapter at the moment, and I'm reflecting on participatory action research and how there's very similar underpinnings to Teaching for Social Justice by Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed and that kind of thing, of moving away from the norm with regards to teaching, trying to decolonize that process of teacher stands and talks to people as if they're empty vessels. That's the thing that everyone's trying to get away from when we talk about decolonizing and kind of moving away from the westernized standard of teaching that everyone seems to be held to. So yeah, it's been a process, and I think although action research has a lot of critique, I didn't see a way of trying to generate change in the kind of topic that I was talking about just by doing it like an ethnographic piece of work. I felt that at least to try, it's a very messy process, as I'm sure Manal has said with his work. It's very difficult, and it's not linear. It's very difficult, but I also think that it was probably the best way to try and introduce and talk about these concepts with staff members, because it was the first time that they had dedicated the space to be able to sit down and actually talk some of these things through.
Great. And we'll maybe come back to some of the findings, or tentative findings, I suppose we'll say. And I know you don't want to share too much, but we'll talk a little bit about maybe some of the impacts that you've had as a result of some of that action research. Let's talk a little bit then about your experiences then. And we have to be, I suppose, somewhat reflexive here. So I suppose the first question is, I guess, a little bit challenging. What I'm interested in hearing a little bit from both of you, I suppose, is you've been engaging with the research. You've got your own frustrations as well, of your own experiences of being in a marginalised group or being marginalised and working within sport, being in higher education. How are you managing to find an appropriate distance to the project as a researcher, or maybe how are you planning on managing that, Tallin, with your dissertation? It's maybe worth sharing some of your own experiences here, as coaches working in sport or being students in higher education. But how are you finding an appropriate distance away from that literature, not just taking it as gospel and still maintaining a level of criticality then when you're actually in the field and you're doing your research?
Yeah, I can do. In terms of the more emotional side of things, like maintaining that distance, like you said, especially when it's topics and stuff that is when it hits close to home, when it's very personal stuff to myself or to people that I care about, it is difficult to maintain that sort of professional distance, I suppose, from the very emotional responses that I'll have to reading certain things or seeing certain things, and frankly, so there was a paper that I was reading recently that I came across as part of sort of my initial literature review for my dissertation, talking about legislation around transgender women in rugby, playing women's rugby specifically. And reading through the introduction, it talks about how there's an unacceptable level of risk that comes from trans women playing women's rugby. And that idea of the unacceptable level of risk gets brought up a couple of times through the paper, and it very rarely has a source attached to it. I was able to find, in the introduction bit, there is a source, there is a single source given for this sort of statement that, actually, I've got the quote written down. The transgender women competing in rugby poses an unacceptable level of risk. The source that was given was a BBC Sport article. It's the only source that was given for that very, very blanket, very damning statement. And so I keep reading the paper. I take time to sort of digest it. I read it through a couple times, so I'm not just going off that first emotional reaction. And as I'm on my, I think, third read through of it, I then start to look at some of the sources that have been cited. And I click on this article, I follow the link, and it's an article which is talking about how much of a positive difference playing rugby has made in this transgender woman's life. And it's talking about how much the team has accepted her and how well she gets along with the team, and talks about how, like, in terms of compared to the rest of the team, because she has gone through a number of changes due to hormone replacement therapy, she actually struggles compared to some of the cisgender women in the team. And the specific phrase that was picked out of that generally very positive, very honestly heartwarming article that was picked out of it by the author of this paper was one or two, I think it was 2 sentences total, that mentioned how there was a single instance of this trans woman making a very good tackle. And I think the exact quote is folding the other player like a deck chair. And it even goes on to say that specifically her and the player that she folded like a deck chair are fine. There was no hard feelings. No one was hurt. None of that. And that sentence is what was used as evidence for there being an unacceptable level of risk, which, you know, is the kind of thing which feels, at best, unintentionally deceptive. At worst, it's scary.
There's quite a lot to sort of unpack in that. I guess the first thing is that the quality of the literature is not necessarily of the level that we would perhaps like it to be. In terms of the sources, like you're saying, that are being used. There are perhaps some slightly less informed minds or less critical minds that are reading that and taking that as gospel. And taking that as, well, this is now informing my opinion, and my opinion is thus. So perhaps we need to make sure that people are understanding the criticality they have to have when they're reading.
Absolutely. And the thing that actually stuck out to me was when the first 2 times I read through that paper, I didn't even think to actually read the source. I just went, this paper is in an academic journal. You know, it must have been cited correctly. All of the sources must be like accurate and proper sources. So I didn't interrogate it further. I didn't read the sources further. So I just didn't consider that it might have been a misrepresentation of the data. And, you know, when it comes to actually writing, you know, an academic paper, be it like an assessment for a module or my full dissertation, it's important to then, even though there is that very emotional reaction to it, to give it, not necessarily give it like props or anything, but give it space and actually talk about it properly rather than just going, this is bad. Bad. Like, it is important to still talk about things which you react to emotionally from a proper academic level, and using the proper channels and methods to detangle the sort of misinformation that is out there. And that's, in my mind, the most crucial thing that I'm going to find writing my project, is making sure that I do things properly rather than, you know, getting caught up in the emotion of it.
Great, absolutely. And Emma, have you had similar experiences yourself?
I wouldn't say, just because, like, gender in coaching, I think, is one of the few areas with regards to marginalised groups within a sporting environment that has actually been more researched than potentially other marginalised groups. I think I just kind of threw myself into wanting to know more. I'm very much somebody who likes to just find stuff out. So learning about kind of the gender inequalities within an environment, I was like, to me, that's old news, because that's just something, being a female within sport, that's just a given. So I just really wanted to understand other areas of marginalized groups, of what are they facing? Is it different? Is it similar? What is it that they're facing in higher education that I haven't faced, or what is it like? How different is the path that I'm taking, the path that they're taking, just because they don't have X, Y, and Z, they don't have this support, they don't have accessibility to whatever. I think that was how I was able to distance myself from that, but also, I guess, potentially give me confidence or give me kind of the fire and the, I don't know, I can't think of the word, the passion, I guess, to want to investigate this further, but also to talk with people that are also like me, we're all white, whether they were having similar feelings or talking about it, or it's interesting as a group being able to be reflexive and be like, oh, actually, maybe previously I didn't see this as colourblindness. Like the whole I don't see race thing, the impact that is potentially having, but being able to deconstruct that with people and then talk about like why was it was like that, and why, and we were talking about equality and said why is equity a better word in that kind of thing, like why is this person the best for the job? Is it because they've been afforded the best education, they're from a stable socioeconomic background, they have two parents that have been able to fund their way all the way through? Is that why they're the best person for the job? So it was those kind of conversations that we were having, and I think from the perspective, and maybe although we were talking as a group around race, potentially talking about it now, maybe that was something else I was interested in too. So I think maybe that was just a natural progression that we were all going down, that we were all in it together and talking about these topics.
Have either or both of you felt like your reading has sort of informed your understanding of what it is that you've maybe been through before in terms of your experiences, or just, I don't want to say make peace, but just understand, right, this is what the reality is that I'm living, and I've kind of, I'll use it because I don't have better words, I've sort of made peace with that, but also, well, this is what I need to do if I'm going to help to change this or to open other people's eyes to that reality. Is that typically come from doing the reading for you?
I wouldn't say, I don't know if it's necessarily like make peace. I think it's more kind of like just like a disappointment in the sense that like, we're in 2024 now, and we're still facing these issues. I remember reading a paper, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was looking at coaches in Canada or North America, and it was like in the 1990s or whenever it was, that like 78% of, or something like that, like a high percentage of women coaches were coaching women's teams. And then you fast forward however many decades, and that's gone down significantly. So it almost seems that there's still so much work to do. And although we're getting to a point where, from a female perspective, that we're finally making tracks, but like the fact, for example, for women's football, that was literally stopped by men. Like women were literally not allowed to play football. Like we're still going through these kind of reparations to try and, like, it's in a lifetime of, like, my mum played cricket. She used to play cricket in a skirt and long socks, which is unfathomable to someone like me, but like that was her reality. And she was only born like 50 odd years ago, you know? So I think it's just kind of a disappointing realization that regardless of how new this research and these projects are, it's still the same things that are coming out. And I think that was more what I realized of, wow, I thought at least maybe things would be changing, but it definitely hasn't changed as much as I thought it would be.
Tallin, for you?
So I wouldn't say that there's. I know it was the words that you had, but I'd agree with Emma. There isn't that degree of making peace with it. Fully agree with the disappointment. Like that's that.
I'm not angry. I'm just disappointed.
Yeah, no. It honestly sometimes I know it's not the case, but it feels sometimes like every single paper I read that isn't like vocally in support of transgender people, it will make reference to something that is either wrong, out of date, or just actively hateful. And it's very disheartening to see. And there isn't, because discussions around, especially in the mainstream media, discussions around transgender people are a relatively new thing, despite trans people having existed for, as long as human history has. It's still a very new thing in the mainstream media. So all of the discussions and all of the data or most of the data that we have access to is all very recent. So there isn't that aspect of looking back and seeing how things have changed on a wider scale. But there is that aspect of looking at 10, 15 years ago, this kind of thing wasn't talked about as much, so there wasn't as much hate around it. And it does almost feel like there has been a backward step, because the more attention it gets, the more attention people who are bigoted tend to get. And again, I won't name names, but there are certain individuals who now it seems that their entire platform on social media or platforms like YouTube or Twitter or X is based around just being hateful, and it's really sad to see. To be honest,
I think the social media side of things is something that is also, I don't know, it's an easy way for people to anonymously just spew whatever hatred, or it could be to anybody. It could be death threats. It could be anything. It could be derogatory comments, sexist, racist, whatever it may be.
And it's not even anonymous sometimes.
Well, exactly. That it's just so easy, and also as a professional sports person or as somebody who potentially has a platform or shows himself publicly on social media, it is so easy. People have access to you 24/7. So I just think it's a very difficult thing to try and also fight against, because you've got to pick and choose. If there's a photo of a female athlete and the next thing you know, the first comment's going to be "get back in the kitchen." It's old. Did you come up with that all by yourself, kind of thing? But it's so difficult to know how it's ever going to stop, and you also have to pick your battles, don't you? It's a lot of energy to talk to someone. If somebody thinks that transgender athletes shouldn't be playing, or they don't think women should be pundits, for example, if they've got that view and they're so violent and kind of so expressive and so in your face around it, is it really worth your time to try and change that point of view? It's picking your battles, and I think social media makes it tough, because it's something you can constantly see. So I think I can imagine it's probably the same. It's tough to think that although you might be able to have a small change, and even though change is quite difficult, it's quite overwhelming when you think of the bigger picture. Is it just a drop in the ocean? Is it even gonna make anything? So
yeah, of course. I guess one of the messages that's coming through this is about the necessity to, Tallin, you're referencing that article, is to talk about the things that you're finding, that you're reading, the things that anger you, the things that rile you up, the things that are good as well at the same time, what might be good in practice, etc. Social media is not the right platform to have a conducive conversation about the things that are actually coming out of it. Is there also a message then that we need to try and create spaces where people can engage in those conversations? And I'm thinking, of course, about coaches here as well, but wider society. Is there a challenge that we're facing here in terms of creating spaces for longer form conversation, discussion that can be a little bit more critical and also safe, inclusive for people to come in and speak about their experiences or what it is that they're reading?
Well, one thing I will say is, and actually I will name the author and the article, because this is the positive one. It's the BBC Sport article I mentioned, which was, incorrectly, I'll say, referenced in the other paper, is by, let me get the first name, I think it is Seri Coleman-Phillips. It's the article, Transgender Rugby Player Playing with a Smile on My Face. And, even though it came from a piece of research which was upsetting to read, being able to read about a story like Kelly Morgan's brings a level of hope for me personally, in terms of, like, there are spaces out there where people are accepting. There are spaces where you don't have to worry about people who are bigoted, who are hateful, who are just generally not very nice. And I think by, like you mentioned, creating those spaces where people are able to talk about their experiences and have long-form discussions about it, one of the main things that will come from that is that people who have these experiences feel that much more comfortable talking about their own experiences, which, adds to the pool of things and information that we can draw on to sort of, be more accepting of other people and more understanding of everyone's experience.
Mm-hmm.
So by creating those safe spaces, all it's going to do is make people feel more comfortable.
Great. One of those safe spaces might very well be in research. So it might very well be the opportunity to share one's experiences with a qualified researcher, a good researcher perhaps, who is there ready, willing to share stories, to get more positive stories about experiences of marginalised groups, for example, out into the open world. And we have, of course, our own challenges with trying to disseminate research better, hence things like podcasts. But that leads us probably quite nicely into telling what you're planning to do for your undergrad dissertation. So we've already spoken a little bit about the rationales. We've spoken a little bit about the literature, what the literature's saying about marginalised groups. Tallin, why don't you tell us a little bit about how that's maybe informing the project that you're planning on starting, and a bit of detail about, well, what exactly is that project?
Yeah, sure thing. So over the course of last year, in my course, there's been an increased focus on sociology and social theory in the wider context of sports, as opposed to just coaching specifically. Which, is something I've very much enjoyed. I've been really, digging my teeth into it. And because of that enjoyment that I found from it, I wanted to do a research project that really focused on that more social and sociological aspect of sports as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And, the stories around and the experiences of transgender athletes within sports is something that, that's very close to home.
Mm-hmm.
It's something which I think is very, very important to share. So, over the course of a number of discussions with lecturers and tutors, just within the course and within the uni as a whole, I sort of refined that and settled on doing an autoethnographic study, talking about my own experiences as a trans athlete and a trans coach now, and more importantly, the way that my relationship with sports and sporting environments has changed as my own journey of learning who I am and becoming who I am has has changed my perspective on things and changed the way I interact with people. And yeah, I mean, like I said, I think it's incredibly important to get these, perspectives and people's stories out there. So why not my own?
Fair enough.
It's
to start somewhere.
Yeah. It's it's something which took me a while to sort of click with in terms of like my own experience has value in that same sense. You know, it was a discussion with Manel driving back from a volleyball Bucks game that I remember quite strongly, where you know we were having a discussion about my experience, being trans in general, but also like a number of times sort of introducing people to the concept of being trans, which is an experience, not necessarily a bad one, but it's an experience. And it sort of culminated in Manel sort of reinforcing that idea that my perspective is one which is, important to get out there, because, I mean, like I said, it'll encourage people to share their own experiences and form a greater understanding of what it is like to be trans.
Perfect. So would you say they, obviously we don't know what the findings are going to be, but would you say that one of your hopes for the project are to try to open the gates, as it were, for more people to share their stories and for them to just understand in the first instance that whole concept of what it means to be trans?
I mean, if I can do, even if it's just like the initial steps towards that, I'd be over the moon. Like if it can make any kind of difference on the road to people being understood and people being accepted, more importantly for who they are, I could ask for nothing else. That is incredibly important to me.
And so you've mentioned sort of this maybe being framed somewhat sociologically. Have you got a particular sort of theoretical framework for this? Any concepts that you're looking to tackle this with?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, it's going to be autoethnographic. So functioning as more of a story rather than, here are some numbers, here is some data, these are the conclusions to draw from it. It's more forming a narrative around my experiences, and the way that the experiences shaped me, the way, my perspective shaped the experiences. Very much in the same sort of wavelength as Ellis's work on autoethnographies. A particular paper that gave a good degree of inspiration was I'll get the reference. Potrak, Jones, Gilbourne, and Nelson, and the title of it's Handshakes, Barbecues, and Bullets: Self-Interest, Shame, and Regret in Football Coaching, which was published in 2013, and it's talking about Potrak's experiences as an assistant coach in a footballing environment, and the way that those experiences changed him, and the way that they affected him and his sort of relationship with football and coaching. And if I can, based off of that kind of work, I'm just trying to think about how to phrase this. That kind of forming a narrative around the experiences, something I particularly noticed reading through that example is that there are chapters. They're framed as like rule 1, rule 2, etc. Where there's no references at all. It's all purely the narrative, the story, and then there are 2 sections at the end, which is talking about the theoretical background and the purpose of the article, and then talking about like conclusions that can be drawn from it. And I think that separation of narrative and the sociological theory that it can inform and is informed by is, a distinction which, I mean, going back to the reflexivity of it, it's an important distinction to have, but it also provides a very good opportunity to further interrogate these kind of experiences. experiences.
Absolutely. And you've already answered the next question that I had listed down, which is perfect, which was to ask you a little bit about how you're going to manage that reflexivity a little bit. I think it sounds like a great project. Very much looking forward to seeing how you progress with it, as well as reading it at the end. So we'll make sure that that we maybe get you back on once we've got that done and dusted, and we can share that with the world, because I'm sure that's going to be really impactful. The final little bit of the pod, so we've gone just a little bit over an hour now, and we still haven't spoken really about findings and things like that, all these sort of exciting stuff from it. So we're going to use this final section as a bit of a wrap-up for some of the ideas, the concepts, some of the messages. We've been ranting a little bit as we've gone through the session, as we've gone through the podcast. So we're not going to do a rant at the end of this podcast. It's going to stand alone in its own regard. But what would you say are some of the core messages, whether it's findings from the PhD or just anything that we've chatted through today, that you want the listeners to take away from the pod?
Probably looping back to your idea of, should we be giving space to these kind of like the space, the environments, the opening up the kind of uncomfortable conversations around this? And I think that is probably one of the biggest things. I say one of the biggest things, but like the reason that my project was able to happen, we gave this time, and I was lucky enough my participants gave the time and space for the focus groups to happen. Something with EDI is that it's constantly considered an add-on. I had huge ethical difficulties in this being a burden on staff time. So that in itself almost set the tone for the perception of what EDI and trying to change things and being a part of kind of EDI training. That's the assumption, is that it's a big, huge overhaul and something that everyone needs to be doing all of the time. So that kind of set the tone. And although it is going to be a lot of work, because it's going to be doing stuff that a lot of people aren't doing, whether it's talking about these things, making time, reading a little bit more around these areas. But nothing's going to be done if it's just stuck on the end of something, if it's just a tick box online e-module. It's not really doing the job. So I think, not to allude too much into my other findings, is that like being able to have that space, and then also having facilitators within that space to probe with questions, be critical of one another. But I'm starting to talk about it in my results coming up, is the fact that the group that I had, I think it works well when there is good team cohesion and a mutual understanding and respect within that space. I think it would be, just from the way that we've interacted as a group, has been very good. Kind of, there was a lot of openness to allow these conversations and people's experiences to come forward, even when they could be quite daunting. But if you had a group that potentially didn't have that same level of respect, and to be able to walk away from that group and not have a falling out because someone didn't agree with what you were saying, I think I was quite lucky in that respect of, it was understood that we spoke about it. It's all part of a good kind of like critical practice of making everyone become better kind of academics in and around these kind of areas and these notions. So yeah, I think they're kind of the biggest takeaways so far, pending, of means of creating that space, and then what you do in that space to facilitate conversation. It's
really got me thinking. We spoke about it, I know, before, but just this idea that when you're trying to make sense of anything, whether it's a touchy subject or not, part of the understanding or the learning process is to get things out of your brain, out of your mouth, onto paper, whatever it might look like. And actually you take a huge amount of risk when you do that, because it's not going to come out in the order that it perhaps should do according to someone else's expectations of you in the written format or the spoken format. And so actually I think, that cohesion bit and that understanding that people will make mistakes is an absolutely critical part to us moving anything forward, not just this conversation about marginalised groups and their experiences within sport, higher education, society more broadly speaking, but anything, any theory, any topic, anything that's new or a little bit abstract, you've got to get it out, and that's can feel a very risky thing. I felt it myself, just in the conversation during the pods. what order do I put these words in? How do I say this, etc.
But Geth yesterday, I had a supervisory meeting yesterday, and he sent me something that they'd been using on the Talk Doctorate. I think Charlie sent it to him about the idea of like stupidity, and how like I think it was I haven't got around to reading it yet, but it was about the idea of there needs to be almost like a level of stupidity when you're navigating new topics, and kind of the idea of everyone says that, and there's no such thing as a stupid question, but there's obviously going to be times if you don't know how to speak around these topics, or you don't know how to bring it up, or ask the sensitive question, or you're probably going to feel a bit stupid at times. But like that's part of the process of trying to improve. If it's better to do that than to just avoid it. Full stop.
Great, magic. And Tallin, for you?
I mean, sort of continuing on from that point, it's also important to be forgiving of people's mistakes.
Yeah.
Like, you know, in my personal life, I've had a lot of experiences of people using the wrong name, or using the wrong pronouns, or, you know, using the wrong terminology, whatever it may be. But it is important to bear in mind that as long as people are trying, and people are like open to having these discussions, they are open to being told when they have made a mistake or said something, you know, maybe slightly upsetting, then, you know, that is the kind of setting, and that's the kind of space in which these important discussions can happen, you know, regardless of of who is taking part in it.
Right.
When there is a space created where when people feel comfortable to make those mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of works both ways in that regard. You know, you have to have that, you know, be okay saying something potentially stupid, but equally receiving feedback in relation to that, and also being able to give feedback in relation. I think it takes a huge amount of bravery to actually correct someone. A lot of the time, if someone says something to me and I'm not too sure about it, I'll probably just kind of ignore it and go, oh, never mind, it's not sort of worth my time. And actually finding the spaces to be able to correct people, I think, is something else. Perfect. They're really nice messages. So as we said, we're not going to finish with any ranting today, as we've covered some of the gripes and myths during the discussion anyway. So that just leaves us to wrap up this episode of the pod. So huge thank you to the pair of you. Thank you, Tallin. Thank you, Emma, for joining us today. Best of luck finishing the PhD. Best of luck embarking on your dissertation.
Thank you.
Thanks again to the Sport Broadcast team for their continued support. We'll be back very soon with another episode, so make sure you leave us a rating on your podcast platform. Subscribe to the podcast if you're on YouTube, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a rating and a review on your favourite podcast platform. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe.
If you want to stay up to date with all of the latest work coming out of the Coaching Hub, please follow us on social media. All the relevant links are in the description.
And if you'd like to be featured in an upcoming listener special episode, drop us your questions to coachinghub@cardiffmet.ec.uk.